This story isn't just disturbing, it will haunt you long after it ends. A mother, her young child, and a horrifying truth hidden behind closed doors. When authorities stepped inside the apartment, what they found was beyond anything they had ever seen. Rotting food, human waste smeared on the walls, the unbearable stench of neglect, and a tiny, lifeless body left alone in the filth. This tragedy unfolded in Indianapolis, Indiana, inside a small, run-down apartment complex. What happened to 2-year-old Skylar Gardner wasn't just a case of negligence. It was something far worse. A crime so cruel that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it. At the center of this horrifying case was 32-year-old Chantel Gardner. A woman who should have been Skylar's protector, but instead became the reason she never had a chance to grow up. She wasn't an absent mother in the way most people would imagine. She wasn't working late shifts or struggling to make ends meet. No. Chantel made a choice. A deliberate, calculated choice that would cost her child everything. For weeks, she left Skylar alone in an apartment crawling with rats, a place unfit for any living being. But while her daughter starved, while her cries went unanswered, Chantel was elsewhere, staying at her boyfriend's house. She wasn't stranded. She wasn't in distress. She was simply gone. Neighbors had heard the child's cries, but they didn't know just how dire the situation was. The signs were there, the awful smell leaking from the apartment, the eerie silence that followed Skylar's desperate screams, the fact that no one ever seemed to see Chantel coming or going, but no one could have imagined the horror that was unfolding inside. Then, one day, everything changed. A welfare check turned into a crime scene. Officers entered the apartment, expecting to find a struggling family in need of help. Instead, they found something out of a nightmare. Skylar's small body was there, alone, in the same filth she had been left in for weeks. The conditions were unimaginable. The officers who found her would later say it was one of the worst things they had ever witnessed. But the most chilling part? Chantel Gardner didn't seem to care. She had continued living her life as if nothing had happened, spending nights with her boyfriend, ignoring the reality of what she had done. No remorse, no panic, just absence. How does a mother walk away from her own child? How does she knowingly leave her baby to die while she enjoys the comforts of another home? And perhaps the biggest question of all, was this just neglect, or was it something even more sinister? As investigators dug deeper into Chantel's life, the answers they found were even more horrifying than they expected. This is the horrifying case of Chantel Gardner. In the heart of Indianapolis, Indiana, nestled within a modest apartment complex, lived 33-year-old Chantel Gardner. To those who knew her casually, Chantel appeared to embody the archetype of a resilient single mother, striving to provide for her 2 young children, Skylar, a cherubic 2-year-old with an infectious smile, and her 4-year-old brother, whose name has been withheld to protect his privacy. Her social media profiles painted a picture of familial warmth and dedication, a testament to a mother doing her utmost amidst life's challenges. However, the curated images and status updates masked a far grimmer reality. Behind the closed doors of her apartment, Chantel's life was unraveling in ways that few could have imagined. The once attentive mother had become increasingly absent, both physically and emotionally, from her children's lives. The catalyst for this transformation was her relationship with 38-year-old Brian Thomas, a man whose past was as opaque as his intentions. Brian entered Chantel's life under the guise of a caring partner. His demeanor was unassuming, and he possessed an uncanny ability to present himself as a pillar of support. Yet, beneath this facade lay a history checkered with dubious associations and a propensity for evading personal scrutiny. Little was known about his background, a deliberate obscurity that would later cast a shadow over the events leading up to Skylar's tragic end. As Chantel's infatuation with Brian deepened, her priorities shifted perilously. Nights once spent reading bedtime stories and ensuring her children's well-being were now occupied by extended stays at Brian's residence. Neighbors began to notice her sporadic presence, but the walls of urban living often breed isolation. and few felt it their place to intervene. Inside the Gardner apartment, the absence of maternal care became increasingly evident. The children, left to their own devices, navigated a world devoid of structure and nurturing. The refrigerator, once stocked with essentials, now stood as a barren reminder of neglect. Unwashed dishes piled up, and the air grew thick with the stench of unaddressed waste. The laughter that once echoed through the halls was replaced by an eerie silence, occasionally broken by the muffled cries of two souls yearning for attention. Brian's involvement in this descent was as insidious as it was indirect. While he maintained a physical distance from the apartment, his influence over Chantal was profound. Phone records and text messages would later reveal a man aware of the neglect, yet indifferent to its consequences. His priorities lay elsewhere, and the well-being of Chantal's children was a burden he neither accepted nor acknowledged. The facade maintained by Chantal began to crumble under the weight of her choices. Family members' inquiries about the children's well-being were met with evasive answers. Social media updates became less frequent, and when they did appear, they lacked the authenticity of earlier posts. Friends who once admired her resilience now whispered among themselves, sensing that something was amiss, but lacking the evidence or courage to confront it. The tipping point came on a frigid January evening. Chantal, having spent yet another night away, returned to the apartment with the intention of a brief check-in. Upon calling out for her children, only her son responded, his eyes reflecting a blend of confusion and relief. Skylar's absence was initially dismissed as a child's playfulness, but as minutes ticked by, a gnawing dread set in. The search led Chantal to a lightweight dresser in the corner of the children's bedroom. There, beneath the overturned piece of furniture, lay Skylar's lifeless body. The room, already a testament to squalor, now became the epicenter of an unfathomable tragedy. The innocence lost within those walls would soon become a focal point for a community grappling with the horrors hidden in their midst. As the gravity of the situation settled in, the next steps would involve law enforcement and a deeper exploration into the circumstances that led to such a devastating outcome. The investigation would peel back layers of deception, neglect, and complicity, revealing the stark reality behind the Gardner family's closed doors. The call came in just after 8 a.m. on the morning of January 25, 2025. A woman's voice, frantic yet oddly detached, told the 911 dispatcher that her child was unresponsive. "It's my daughter. I think she's not breathing," Chantal Gardner stammered. Her voice cracked, but there was no urgency, no hysteria that one might expect from a mother discovering her child lifeless. The dispatcher's training kicked in. "Ma'am, is she breathing at all? Can you try CPR?" "I don't know. I just found her. I don't know how long." The dispatcher pressed further, instructing her to check for signs of life, but Chantal remained vague, her words slipping into panicked breaths and unintelligible murmurs. When emergency responders arrived at the apartment, the door was slightly ajar, as if whoever had last come through had been too shaken or too careless to shut it. The moment the paramedics stepped inside, they were met with a stench so overpowering that one of them gagged. The odor of decay and human waste clung to the air, thick and inescapable. What they saw next would haunt them. The living room was in complete disarray. Discarded fast food containers stacked on the countertops, dirty clothes piled in corners, broken furniture crammed against the walls. The television was still on, flashing the remnants of a children's show, its colors muted against the filth-ridden walls. But the most disturbing part was the feces smeared across the furniture, embedded in the worn-out mattress on the floor, even streaked on the walls in patterns that made it clear these children had been left to fend for themselves for far too long. As the paramedics moved further in, stepping over scattered debris and half-eaten food rotting on the floor, they found Chantal standing in the dimly lit bedroom, frozen in place. She didn't meet their eyes, her gaze locked on the small body lying on the floor beneath an overturned dresser. Skylar Gardner's tiny frame was still, her once bright eyes closed forever. She was wearing only a thin, soiled onesie, her bare arms and legs exposed to the bitter cold of the unheated apartment. Her skin was a sickly pale blue, her lips tinged purple from the frigid temperatures. Her hands were clenched into delicate fists, and her feet, small and fragile, showed the early stages of frostbite. A veteran paramedic knelt beside her and placed 2 fingers against her neck, searching for any sign of life, though he already knew what he would find. There was no pulse. Her skin was ice-cold to the touch. The paramedic swallowed hard. "She's gone." The room fell silent except for the shallow, erratic breathing of Chantel, who finally seemed to snap back to the present. She let out a choked sob, but didn't move, didn't fall to her knees in anguish, didn't reach for her daughter. Instead, she whispered, almost to herself, "I didn't mean for this to happen." Police officers arrived minutes later, their boots crunching against the debris-strewn floor as they stepped inside. The lead detective, a seasoned investigator who had seen his fair share of neglect cases, took one look at the state of the apartment and felt a deep, unsettling rage build inside him. "What the hell happened here?" one officer muttered under his breath. They secured the scene, documenting everything. Photographs of the squalid conditions, the dresser under which Skylar had been trapped, the makeshift sleeping arrangements for the children. Skylar's older sibling, a 4-year-old boy, was found curled up in a corner of the room, clutching a tattered stuffed animal. He was weak, his little body malnourished, his cheeks sunken. He flinched when officers approached, his wide, fearful eyes darting between them and his mother. "Hey, buddy," one officer crouched down, trying to soften his voice. "Are you okay?" The child didn't respond. He only gripped his stuffed animal tighter, his tiny fingers trembling. As officers examined the apartment, the depth of the neglect became disturbingly clear. There was no working heater. The only source of warmth was a small pile of blankets in the corner, barely enough to shield 2 small children from the harsh winter temperatures. There was little food in the refrigerator, just a half-empty carton of spoiled milk, a few crusts of bread, and condiments. It was evident that these children had been left alone for extended periods, scrounging for whatever scraps they could find. Detectives quickly turned their attention to Chantel, who sat motionless on the couch, her hands gripping her own arms as if holding herself together. "When was the last time you saw her alive?" a detective asked, his voice steady but firm. I don't know," Chantel murmured. "Maybe yesterday morning? Or the night before? She was just playing." Her voice trailed off. One of the officers frowned. "You don't know?" Chantel inhaled sharply, as if trying to grasp onto an excuse. "I had to go out. I wasn't gone long." But her phone records would later tell a different story. Investigators soon learned that Chantel had spent the past several nights at Brian Thomas's apartment, leaving her 2 young children alone in the freezing cold. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed her purchasing cigarettes and alcohol the night before, laughing with Brian, seemingly without a care in the world. And Brian? He was nowhere to be found. Officers immediately tried contacting him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. It wasn't until later that they would uncover the text messages between him and Chantel, messages that painted an even darker picture of the events leading up to Skylar's death. As the forensic team examined the small body lying lifeless on the floor, one thing became clear. Skylar's death was not just a tragic accident. The autopsy would reveal the true horror of what this child endured in her final hours. The investigation was only beginning. Skylar Gardner's body was taken to the coroner's office, where forensic pathologists began the grim task of uncovering the truth. They had seen cases of neglect before, but nothing quite like this. The little girl's frail frame told a story of prolonged suffering, one that no child should have to endure. As the examination began, the findings were nothing short of harrowing. Skylar's skin was discolored from the cold, her extremities bearing the telltale signs of frostbite. The autopsy revealed bruising all over her small body, some fresh, some older, evidence of ongoing abuse rather than a single tragic accident. But the most horrifying discovery came when the medical examiner inspected the inside of her mouth. A deep laceration to the inside of her lip suggested forceful trauma. perhaps a violent shove or an attempt to silence her cries. But then came something even more disturbing. Multiple human bite marks, clearly inflicted before her death, were found on her back and under her arm. Someone had deliberately bitten this child, leaving wounds that had gone untreated. As the examiner continued, another unsettling revelation emerged. When they examined the contents of Skylar's stomach, they found strands of hair, small particles of fabric, and something far worse, traces of feces. It was a sickening confirmation of extreme starvation and neglect. Deprived of food for so long, Skylar had resorted to eating whatever she could find, even if it was something no human should ever have to ingest. But what ultimately killed her? The answer was as tragic as it was infuriating. Hypothermia. The medical examiner determined that Skylar had died from prolonged exposure to the freezing cold. The apartment's temperature had dropped to as low as 46 degrees Fahrenheit, and with no blankets, no proper clothing, and no adult to care for her, she had simply frozen to death. She had died alone, in a dark, filthy apartment, shivering until her tiny body could no longer fight against the cold. As detectives processed the coroner's findings, they prepared to confront Chantel Gardner. By the time they entered the interrogation room, Chantel sat hunched over, her hands resting limply in her lap. The confident, dismissive attitude she had initially displayed during questioning had started to crack. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, fingers twitching anxiously as she avoided eye contact. She was presented with the autopsy report. "Skylar didn't just die," one of the detectives said, his voice controlled but firm. "She suffered, she was starving, she was freezing, and she had injuries that weren't accidental." Chantel's eyes flickered toward the papers on the table, but quickly darted away. I don't know how that happened," she mumbled. The detective leaned forward. "You don't know how your daughter ended up with bite marks on her body?" Chantel's breathing grew uneven. She opened her mouth as if trying to form an excuse, but nothing came. "You said you were there," the detective continued, "that you were cooking when you realized she wasn't responding." Silence. The detective pushed the report closer to her. "We know that's a lie. We know you weren't home for days." At that, Chantel's head shot up, her expression shifting from avoidance to something more defensive. "I was checking in on them," she argued. "I left food." "You left them to rot in their own filth," the detective snapped. "Your daughter was eating hair and feces, she was covered in bruises, and she froze to death alone." Chantel's lips trembled, but still, she refused to fully break. The detective took a deep breath, reining in his anger. "Tell us what really happened." She hesitated. I didn't mean for this to happen." The detective leaned back, arms crossed. "Then who did?" For a moment it seemed like she might confess. Her fingers curled into her sleeves, her shoulders slumped. Then she shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. It was a predictable response, but it only made her look guiltier. That's when they decided to bring in Brian Thomas. Brian Thomas had been avoiding police since the moment Skylar's body was discovered. While Chantel was being questioned, detectives were already working to track him down. When they finally found him, he was at a friend's house, drinking. At the station, Brian sat in the interrogation room with an air of indifference. Unlike Chantel, he wasn't twitching or looking away. He met the detective's gazes head-on, his expression unreadable. "I don't know why I'm here," he said. "Because a little girl is dead," the detective replied coldly. Brian exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "Look, I didn't even live there, okay? I had nothing to do with that mess." The detective tilted his head. "Then explain these." A folder was slid across the table. Inside were pages of text messages exchanged between Brian and Chantel. Some were casual arguments, flirtations, late-night conversations, but others told a far more damning story. "Brian, you going over there or no?" "Chantal, Nah, the fine. Ain't crying nothing." "Brianne, do get. You need to get them some more food or some." Chantal, G23/9:05 a.m. They'll be okay, just a couple more days. The detective studied Brian's face as he read the messages. His jaw clenched, his fingers tapping against the table. You knew they were alone, the detective said. You knew they were starving. Brian scoffed. I told her to take care of them. But you didn't call anyone. You didn't check on them, and when Skylar died, you didn't call 911. Instead, you helped Chantal clean up. Brian's fingers twitched. That's not true. Then why did you delete your messages? Silence. The detective leaned forward. You think you can just delete the truth? We pulled the records, Brian. You were involved. Brian swallowed hard. For the first time, his composure wavered. As the hours dragged on, the weight of the evidence became impossible to ignore. Chantal and Brian's stories crumbled. The truth was undeniable. Skylar had been abandoned, starved, and left to freeze to death, while her mother prioritized her relationship over her children. Brian, for all his denials, had known. He had let it happen. And now, both of them were facing the consequences. As the detectives left the interrogation room, the case was no longer just about neglect. It was about something much darker. The wheels of justice were now in motion, and the trial would bring everything into the light. As the trial of Chantal Gardner unfolds, the courtroom becomes a somber theater, where the harrowing details of young Skylar's life and untimely death are laid bare. Prosecutors present a chilling narrative of neglect and abuse, painting a picture of a mother who abandoned her maternal duties in favor of personal indulgences. The defense, however, strives to humanize Chantal, attributing her actions to overwhelming life circumstances and mental health struggles. Witnesses, including neighbors and family members, take the stand, recounting instances that, in hindsight, were ominous signs of the tragedy to come. Child welfare experts testify about the profound impact of neglect on a child's physical and emotional well-being, emphasizing the suffering Skylar likely endured. Forensic specialists provide detailed analyses of the evidence, from the squalid conditions of the apartment to the injuries found on Skylar's body, each piece meticulously contributing to the narrative constructed by the prosecution. The defense introduces testimonies about Chantal's character before her downward spiral, highlighting her previous attempts to provide for her children and her struggles with mental health issues. They argue that while her actions were inexcusable, they were not born out of malice but rather a profound inability to cope with her circumstances. As the trial progresses, the jury is tasked with sifting through the emotional testimonies and complex evidence to determine the extent of Chantal's culpability. The community watches closely, grappling with their own judgments and the broader implications of the case on societal views of motherhood, responsibility, and mental health. The trial serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by children and the paramount importance of vigilance and intervention. It challenges the community to reflect on the systems in place to protect the most innocent and to consider how such a tragedy could have been prevented. As we await the jury's decision, we are left to ponder the profound loss of a young life and the cascading failures that led to such an outcome. The trial not only seeks justice for Skylar, but also compels us to confront uncomfortable truths about societal responsibilities and the often hidden struggles within our communities. If you believe that every child deserves a safe and loving environment, consider subscribing to our channel. Together, we can raise awareness and advocate for the protection of all children.